This is Redrawing History, a library company webinar. We're coming up on our creative team, which will include Weshoyot Alvitre, Lee Francis, myself, and our fearless moderator, Bill Adair of the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage.
Welcome this afternoon. My name is Bill Adair, and up until just last week, I was a program director at the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage in Philadelphia, and we were fortunate enough to be the funders of this project. And first off, I want to say truly, sincerely that the library company was a kind of model grantee for this project in every way. They came to us when the project was very much in its embryonic stages. And we'll talk about that process in a moment. Very open to feedback from us and many others. Open to seeing where the creative process came and led them. Came to and led them. And were responsive to feedback every step of the way from a variety of constituents on the project. Which is something that we really wanted, was for them to be open to knowing that they were coming from a largely white-staffed organization, and coming from a particular perspective of academia and special collections libraries, being open to what a public history project looks like in 2019, 2020, 2021, and what community input could do to help make the project better. So we're really grateful that it turned out so incredibly successful, and hope that there's lots of long life ahead for the project. But we wanted to look back a little bit at the creative process that went into the making of this, and the kind of first thing I wanted to talk about was kind of the conditions that were present in order to make this project happen, because it is ideal in so many ways. Those of us in the public history field who are wanting organizations to take greater risks with methods of interpretation and new strategies for reaching audiences are looking for projects like this. And looking for organizations that are willing to take these kinds of creative risks. So I wanted to start, I think, with Will, although anyone, any of the other panelists who can, who'd want to throw some thoughts in would be very welcome. What were given that this was, I think, by almost anybody's standards, is a successful method of creative interpretations and a new strategy for reaching audiences. What were the conditions that were present at your organization, Will, and in the project that allowed for risk-taking, for your imagination, Will, as, by the way, I want to call out your title, which is Director of Scholarly Innovation.
That's right.
Is that correct?
Tall order, right?
Which I think, yeah, I mean, I think that's a condition of creativity right there. So that's an example of the organization building the connection between scholarship and innovation into a title, and valuing it enough to create a special position for that. Anyway, I don't want to answer the question myself. What were and are the conditions in the organization and elsewhere that allowed for a project like this to even breathe and find life in the first place?
You were doing such a good job answering your question, though. I mean, I feel obliged to turn it back to you, Bill.
I would often do.
No, first things first, leadership. Mike Barsanti, who we heard from at the top of the day, was very willing to take a risk on this project, to take a risk on someone, myself, who he didn't particularly know all that well at that time. We actually met when I was still in graduate school, and I had been a research fellow at the library company. So for him to recognize the public merit of the project and to see what I saw in the possibility of turning this into a graphic novel, I think really speaks to his instincts. Also, you know, having a good team around me, because getting something like this off the ground wouldn't have happened if I didn't have a great development officer here, Rachel Hammer. We didn't have great technical people who we'll be hearing from in the next panel, and McShane and Nicole Scalessa, a great programming person. That was first Claire Lowry, but now it's Dayjah Brock. And then of course we have an awesome exhibition person, Jennifer Rosner, who helped us to really push the boundaries of what a library company public art exhibition might look like. So there were a lot of institutional resources, and there was a lot of willingness to take risk. But honestly, I feel obliged to recognize that this probably wouldn't have worked if I hadn't gone out to Indigenous Comic-Con at the very beginning of this process. And that was only possible because I had a meeting with you. This would have been back in like 2017 or something. And you came up with a seed grant where I, you know, suddenly had like enough money to hop on a plane and go out to Albuquerque. And that was you investing in this idea before we could even put anything forward. I might let Lee take that over because Indigenous Comic-Con is very much something of his creation.
Yeah, thanks. So I think that Gawatsi Haupa, the Wachawashrap, Wahiname Lee Francis, Washesh Kawekame Marikaname, since I'm just jumping on, that's my introduction. Dr. Lee Francis, my family is from the Pueblo of Laguna. For some of you that, you know, have read the book, and if you know what's going on, we do our introductions and all the rest of that. It's, you know, it's kind of important. It's a cultural thing. So, but anyhow, so back to the story. It was, I love telling the story because it's one of those stories, because I've been in the industry for publishing now for about 6 years, but prior to that, really as a writer, knowing how the industry works, and oftentimes I would get, throughout my life and career, I'd get emails from folks that would definitely have ideas. Everybody has an idea. They've got a native idea, and since we're the native comic book shop and I'm a native publisher, everybody's got like, I got this idea about writing about native folks, and I was like, and I've heard hundreds of ideas, and usually I'm just like, okay, cool. Have you talked to the local community? Do you know anything that's going on? You know, are you actually, like, have you walked the land? Like, all these types of things. And so, you know, I get this email from Will, and Will hits me up and he's like, I got this idea. And I was like, all right, here we go. And he tells me about this historical moment and this incident. And I was like, okay, that's cool. And then he says, hey, I'd like to come out to Indigenous Comic-Con. So for those of you that have never gone to a Comic-Con before or don't quite know what it is, Comic-Con is basically just a big collection of pop culture fans and nerds. People dress up in the characters, you know, that they like from comic books or movies or whatnot. When we founded it, or when I founded it, the idea was that we wanted to bring Native folks specific about that together into one group. So Native folks that were doing comic books and graphic novels, that were part of film and television, that were doing Indigenous futurism, science fiction and fantasy, video games, etc. So that was, you know, that was our big commitment, and wanted to get everybody into the same room about this. To really just have a good time and showcase to the world that Native folks are really doing some awesome stuff. So that was a big thing for us. So, you know, so I get this, I was like, hey, that sounds interesting to Will. It's like, you know, I have to go back and check the actual email, but I was like, that sounds really interesting. You know, tell me a little bit more. And he's like, hey, I'd like to come out to Indigenous Comic-Con this year, and maybe we can find some time to sit down. I don't know, Will, at this point, I was like, dude, if you can find me, because, you know, as the lead on any event, I'm literally just running around for 3 solid days. So I was like, if you can find me, I'll make some time. If you decide to come out, I will make time sometime during the weekend to sit down with you. So he sends me some of the research materials. I'm like, okay, this is actually really cool. I start to get my interest peaked, and I was like, let's see if my man's going to show up. You know, that's always the big, that's the big thing, right? Like, let's see if he's actually going to make it here. And lo and behold, there's this guy, like, he's the first day, we're just still open, and he's like, are you Lee Francis? And I was like, yeah, are you Will? And he's like, yeah. And I was like, and he's like, do you want to talk now? I'm like, absolutely not. I got all this stuff to put together right now, but we'll find time over the weekend, I promise. So we find some time to sit down. I have a few moments. We go outside. We start talking about his concept for this, and you know, and Will's concept. You know, your concept was amazing. And I think the first thing he gave me was like Abina and the Learned Men, right? That was the graphic novel that had come out from that. So that for me was like, I was like, oh, this is really exciting. This is what we can do. And I started, and then the wheels really started spinning. And with the commitment that Will made, then we start going back and forth, and we're starting to talk about like how we're going to do this, and the grant going into Pew, and like what we need to put together. And I was like, listen, I'll throw my hat in the ring if you would like, I'd like to be considered as a writer on this, but my main goal is to make sure that Native creatives get work. So please go talk to our illustrators. I got tons of them down the line. I'd already worked with Weshoyot on we lost Will. I'd already worked with Weshoyot on my comic book on Six Killer that we had done together. So I was just like, she's amazing. And I always pitch everybody. And so then I was like, but let me throw my hat in the ring. So, thank you, Weshoyot, for coming back and, letting me chat a little bit, and with Will, and kind of throwing my name in the ring. And that's kind of where this all got started.
Was this the most scholarly, or the first kind of scholarly connection that you had made in your life as a kind of impresario? Or have there been other like archival collections, special collections that have come to you with this kind of project before?
No, this was the first. We've done some, I've worked with the Academy. I've worked with academia. The first year we had some, academic folks that were coming, but they were putting together like a manuscript, like an indigenous pop culture manuscript, more than, like a graphic orientation. And, I'd say the work that we did with Dear Woman and with Dr. Elizabeth LaPensée and her work, sort of bridged a little bit around that, but it was much more fiction, definitely Native women oriented. So this truly was, I will say, unqualified, the first, scholarly comic style work that I have been engaged in. So it was really quite a lovely exploration, because my PhD is in education. So it was quite a lovely exploration of bringing sort of my academic side and my scholarly side in with my nerd and artistic writing side, and the creative sides together. With my brain was just my brain was light on both sides. It was fantastic.
Yeah, and obviously, in terms of creating the conditions for creativity here, you were open to taking this leap as well. The library company was open to taking the leap. Being a scholarly institution, working in a new medium, you were willing to take the leap in terms of being comfortable with the medium, and as a writer, as an artist, in terms of working with a scholarly institution. So that was a really happy match in those terms. And then speaking of happy matches, Weshoyot became involved as the amazing artist on the project, the visual artist on the project. So Weshoyot, can you talk to us about how you got involved, and how you came to see the possibilities in this?
Yeah, I have pretty much the similar kind of story. Will had contacted me via email prior to Indigenous Comic Con that year, and kind of proposed the idea and said, hey, I might be able to have some funds to take me out to New Mexico. Can I meet with you for sort of a job interview? I can explain the project a little bit more. And he had plans to meet with me as well as several other artists, and just discuss this and see who he would be like the best fit for the project. So yeah, I was sitting at my table setting up, I think on the first day, and he came up and introduced himself, and we sat down and talked, and I could see how passionate he was about the project. And I already checked out sort of links that he had sent me via email on some of the digital packs and stuff that he was working on. And I could really just see this is, a passion project for him. When I'm sort of asked to work with scholarly or academic people on projects, I'm always a little hesitant, because there's always, you run the risk of it going into, oh, this is going to be another historical account, and we've got all of our facts and stuff, but we just need you for art. And there wasn't a lot of input on my behalf. I'm sort of hired as a work for hire to provide art for what they need, but I don't actually get to contribute very much. So I'm always hesitant doing historical stuff, because I know that them taking the reins on creative, or if there's any misconceptions on the way Native people are represented, that can always be an issue. But he kind of explained like what his goals were in bringing in not only like documents from the library company, but to have tribal representation there. And it really kind of excited me. So he also asked if I had any writers I would throw in. And of course I said Lee, because I've worked with him before and I know that, you know, he has an academic background as well. And I feel comfortable with the way he writes. I know he can write for comic books, and I know that he's going to, you know, do the project justice. So I was like, yeah, like Lee, you know, please talk to him too, because it would be wonderful. You know, you're not bringing in a stranger who I would have to meet and make sure that they're doing, you know, the right thing with what they're doing for the project. So after Indigenous Comic Con, he contacted us again, and then I think somehow my name got picked out of the artists that he had spoken with. And he mentioned that Lee was interested in the project too, and it just kind of continued on from there.
Hey, Bill, I think you're muted right now.
Sorry about that.
It makes it a little harder.
Awesome.
My cat is meowing in my ear, so I'm trying to, yeah. And my dog is begging to go out. So anyway,
Perfect.
I got my
what I was saying is that obviously the trip to Comic, yeah, yeah, this is digital communication, right? The trip to Comic Con became a catalyst and became a kind of crucible for the team, and there was obviously this chemistry kind of between you all right from the start that, you know, that developed first at Comic-Con, which Indigenous Comic-Con, which was amazing. And there's always, I think, a chemistry to a creative project that is either, you know, helping the project move forward or holding it back. And in this case, it certainly pushed it forward. But to go back to Will for a second, even before Comic-Con, or while you were on the plane on the way to Comic-Con, what was in your head about it? What was your vision for it, other than, okay, I have the content. I have this amazing story. It's difficult content. It's really interesting content. It's highly relevant content for the present, right? And then you knew the format that you wanted to work in. Other than those two things, what was your vision for what this thing could be?
Great question. I was driven a lot by the audiences I had in mind. I wanted something that would sort of jailbreak this story from higher ed, because I feel like as an early Americanist, there's no shortage of people that are really well versed in the sort of history of this story, and some of them are really well versed in the materials that we use to tell the story, the pamphlets, the manuscripts, the treaty records, but really. What there's this huge divide between really well, never heard of it before, despite the fact that I think it's an important story that ought to be part of our curriculum. So my first question was, what is the right form of middle school and high school students? That was the first step. The story, I didn't know what it was going to look like, because honestly, I didn't want to be the one driving the story. I feel like I've written a lot about this. I've talked a lot about it, and I was eager to hear what somebody else had some, you know, to bring to this story.
Yeah.
So can the three of you talk a little bit more about then how you began to build trust together in order to take the next steps to turn this from, you know, Will's fantasy project into something that became more concrete? What were your original visions for the project, Lee and Weshoyot? How did you end up dividing the labor? It became a kind of interesting and tricky, not tricky, but perhaps not usual way of working between the four of you, right? So how did the creative team develop here and your way of working?
Well, let me jump in. I mean, just from my perspective, I think.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'll say the first part was for me was that, you know, obviously the commitment from Will, and Weshoyot and I had already worked together, so that we had a really good, you know, bond already around, like, stylistically, and there is a you know, creatively there is an interchange between, you know, writer illustrator, and I think that we had established very early on. There was stuff I was like, hey, I wrote a scene and she fixed it and made it look better, because that's not quite what I had in my brain, but it looks so much better. You know, I had a whole different concept, or like I had a different concept, but once it came to the page, it was, and that, I'm like, when you get a genius illustrator, that's the brilliance, right? Like you get that amazing synthesis. So I think we kind of had that. And then, you know, because we'd worked together, it was really exciting to be able to work on this next project. So there was already some excitement. And then, you know, Will's commitment to doing this in a way that I had never experienced before, you know, in terms of like a group that's bringing in, he's like, hey man, we're going to start, and we got you packed for 3 days. We're going to take you out to the space. We're going to walk the land. And that's literally all the stuff I usually say to folks. I was like, you got to walk the space. You got to be like, you can't talk about a people. You can't write about a people. You can't draw people unless you know who they are. You got to be in that space, right? Indigenous, I'm Pueblo. My family's from Laguna Pueblo. We are Coecame. We are out here in New Mexico. These are my brothers and sisters back east in that space. You know, our Lenape relations, our, you know, our Susquehannock relations, the ancestors from, you know, from the folks that are there. But that's not my people. So I really think it's important that even as Native people, we don't get a pass across all Native people, right? You know, we still have to do the work as well. And so I think partly that commitment from Will's side and from, you know, from the library company, from all the people we just saw, the academics, everybody that was there that wanted to bring this project to life, that dedication for me spoke volumes. Because I think, you know, Weshoyot was alluding to the fact that I've consulted on a number of projects, and I usually have to be very clear up front. I was like, are you just wanting me to check off on this, or do you actually want me to comment on this? Because if I'm just going to check off on this, I can tell you a yes or no right now. But if you want me to actually work on this, then I can do some work. And this wasn't a check off. And this was, you know, this wasn't just a check a box to make sure that the project had a, you know, Native backing. This was, you know, this was a deep reflection and commitment. And even the first day we walked into the library company, and the people around the table, both from Philadelphia, from DC, from New York, my elder and, you know, Curtis, was amazing to see these folks that were in the space. So that to me solidified it. Like once I saw sort of that agenda, I was like, oh, this is for real. And that's that first part, that trust. Like that's where we get into, because then it frees up the rest of the space for us to be honest. Then I can be honest in what I'm interpreting and how I'm writing, because I recognize that Will and the backers, and I've worked in foundational, you know, directions for years, and as a publisher, et cetera, I know that I now have the freedom to write for real. And even while talking about it in the video, I think one of the early on things was that we made the decision as a collective that they are not Paxton boys, they're Paxton murderers. These are adults. They're not aw shucks kiddos. And I felt comfortable to be able to put that point forward. And the team, you know, I know Weshoyot and I were already down on that one anyway, but I know that the rest of the team was really in agreement with being like, no, absolutely. And I didn't have to fight for that. I didn't have to struggle for that, which I may have had to do in a different circumstance. So for me, that was the big part of the creativity. That trust building then allowed me to write better, I will say.
Yeah, I would say from day one, that meeting we had in the room of the library company kind of blew my mind, because it was just all these it was a little uncomfortable space for me, because you walk in, it's a giant table, you're surrounded by books, you have like Ben Franklin's static electricity machine in the corner, and these like old oil paintings.
This one, right?
Like, oh man, this is like, this is really rad, but not necessarily like my space. But then people started coming in, and we had people from Smithsonian, we had people from the library company, and we had Curtis. And when we started talking, and he I think having him there and what he spoke about, because he kind of sensed that, okay, this is new ground for all of us, and this is a very important project, and it's very important to be handled properly. So he was one of the first people to speak, I think, and he really laid it down, and he said he wanted this story done in a respectful way, because, and he went down and explained, how it's going to affect non-tribal members, tribal members, how it can be utilized in education. And it really made me feel good, because I'm like, this is why I'm here, and this is what I anticipate for the project. But to have somebody directly tied into it lay that out from the get-go, that kind of set our bar. And having the academics and however this book is going to be perceived after it's finished, my goal with it was to take what Curtis said on that first day and hold that as my bar. And if I could achieve something that was at least in that field, and doing my best to honor the people that didn't have a voice in the situation, that's really my goal for the project. And I kind of left it in the hands of Will and Lee to work out all the finite details and dates and specific locations and the very historical things. So I know they went back and forth on a lot of stuff with some of the historians that we brought in. And that was really cool for me to see, that they were putting that much time and effort in nailing down very small details just to make sure that we got this right, and as right as humanly possible. And also that everybody was open to working with new discoveries. We started looking into archaeological layouts of buildings and exactly where people were on location in the city when this happened. And we realized that, some of the things that were written didn't quite line up with facts. So we had to be flexible throughout the story and take those things in. Because I was getting notes from like Will and Lee, like after I was well into doing the art, like, oh, hey, we just discovered this, or, oh, hey, a historian just sent us this file. And so, history is not set in stone, as so many people would like to believe. It is very fluid, and there are new discoveries constantly being made. And I think allowing that for this project really, really strengthened it, especially like farther down the line, like that everybody on the team was open to that, from the historians, from Will to Lee's writing. Everybody was very open to, making this the best possible project that we could make.
Wow. So it was clear that you guys discovered that you had shared values here and shared interests, and that you were and shared willingness to take some risks from different perspectives. And it sounds like Will, you worked really hard to sincerely build trust with your artists. And so back at the ranch, at the library company, was there any nervousness about all this truth telling and all this value sharing? And you're representing an organization that's 250 years old, and is the sort of definition of venerable as we use it in Philadelphia. What was the comfort level of the organization at taking this creative leap at this point, in the early stages?
I suppose I benefited from the fact that I'm always working on crazy projects, and so people sort of give me a little bit of latitude. And I was deeply anxious about this project. I mean, I didn't defend my dissertation long ago, and this was more anxiety inducing for me in many ways. Because like the thing about my dissertation was Charles Brockton Brown was going to like scold me, you know, like this is a project where I'm working with living, breathing people, and I want to do it right. And there's a lot of ambiguity, as Weshoyot was alluding to, in terms of the historiography. And so the balance of trying to be faithful to the records that we have, and at the same time allowing for generative possibilities in the gaps and erasures, and then how you sort of document your process. That was all really anxiety inducing for me. Honestly, the hardest part about the project was the exhibition, because I felt such an obligation to Weshoyot and her art. And I knew that she was out in LA, and I didn't want to do it wrong. You know, I mean, like I had curated small exhibitions before, but the stakes were always low enough that it was like, okay, if it's bad, it's bad. It's, you know, it's my project. People will say, I don't really understand it, and move on. If you're working with somebody else's art, you know, it's a different circumstance. So I was so anxious over that exhibition opening. And right before the opening, I'm sure that Lee and Weshoyot remember this, I got this terrible sty on my eye from anxiety. I was so embarrassed, you know, because I've got to get up in front of this group of like 150, 160 people that are crammed into the library company. I've got this horrible, you know, bump on my eye because I'm just like so anxious about it not working in one way or another. And, you know, the stakes are different with like a webinar that might drop in and out versus like somebody's artwork being displayed in a foreign place in a deeply colonial institution. And it was really important to me that all of this be done as respectfully and carefully as possible. And that certainly doesn't mean that I got everything right or that we got everything right, but my hope is that the care and the thought that went behind it is documented well enough that folks will sort of understand where we're coming from.
I think you really set the bar too, in regards to the exhibition and just everything from the beginning of the project to the end of the project. Like even with the exhibition, you went and you commissioned out like a small wampum built example from a living, breathing artist. And that, when I saw that, like I didn't know anything about it, but you went out on your own and you really, really understood how important that is to include that in an academic institution, not like some artifact that they had in the archives somewhere. Because that's so often what we see is something that was made hundreds of years ago, a lot of the time was dug up in burials or obtained illegally, placed in an academic institution as an example. And it really like blew my mind, like to be not only supporting breathing artists in, you know, traditional crafts and arts that they do now, that they've always done, but it really kind of broke that extra wall down, I think. And the fact you guys were, you know, also promoting and selling some of her stuff at the gallery exhibition, like that just goes to show that this story doesn't stop here, but it continues, and they can even, you know, access people that are survivors of this incident, that are living and breathing their traditional, you know, way of life. And it just enforces we are still here, we are not gone. And that's something that's always important in a project like this, that oftentimes is very hard to communicate to outsiders, I think.
And I want to say, I think especially on the exhibition, Will, I mean, we'll heap praise on you because you deserve it. You know, like you suffered with the sty, so you get the praise. Yeah. No, I will say that I think from early on, what was so key was bringing in the community, and bringing in our elders, and you know, and eating, and we did that when we went out to Lancaster and we went out to Circle Legacy, and so for me, I actually had the same nervousness going into this, because creating this product for the community and hoping that I was doing it right, hoping that I was giving the right voice in the right way, again, because it's not my people, right? Again, you know, and we have a certain indigeneity that crosses boundaries, but this, I mean, those aren't entirely my ancestors. So I had such a strong obligation. So I was super nervous that I was like, I hope they like the book. Please enjoy the book, you know? So like when the book was done and you were handing it out, I'm like, all right. And then I show up at Philly and we're there and we're at the library company for like sort of like a grand opening, and then the community starts to come in, and I was like, all right, what did you think? You don't have to do that. But there was, you know, there's a sort of genuineness that you can just tell. People were like, this is amazing, you're awesome, like, you know. And so for me, that was such a relief. Like I was like, okay, we did this right by the community. But I got even, you know, later on, because I was back there in February, wildly enough, right? It seems like a million years ago.
Yeah,
but
right.
February, when we were out there, one of my mentors, Dr. Joseph Bruchac, the incredible, you know, writer, scholar, you know, linguist, martial arts guy. His sister teaches, I think, Penn, right? She teaches at UPenn, Dr. Margaret Bruchac. And he was telling me when we were there at you know, at the convention center slinging books, you know, he was telling me that his sister had made a point to say, to go down and see the exhibit, right? And that recognition, again, from the community, and not just our community, not even just the people we worked with, but the broader Native community in the area that and the East Coast that recognizes how important this work is, and how important this storytelling and this new methodology of storytelling was really profound for me. So I think, you know, that was one of the coolest parts for me when I came back to visit. I was like, I have other people telling me about other people telling them, Native folks, to go see this exhibit. Like that was dynamite. I was like, all right, you know, I'm sure there's flaws. I'm sure there's things we could always do better, but I think we got this one, you know, right out of the initial gate, in the right spirit and the right heart. And for that, there's my praise for you, and always a thank you for allowing me to be a part of this. So.
Well, yeah, and while we're praising folks, I should acknowledge that Curtis is the one who put me in touch with that amazing Wampanoag artist who made that wampum belt, Elizabeth James Berry, who actually came down from Nantucket, I believe it was, for the exhibition opening. It was so touching to have her there and to be able to show her her jewelry that she makes in the very traditional way, to have that available at the library company alongside this exhibition opening. It was really special. And that's a kind of connection where I wouldn't have felt comfortable just trying to find the right person to do this. I wouldn't even know where to start. So, you know, that's where having somebody that could say, here are two people that you ought to focus on. And this is a really great person who's very careful in the work that she does. And you can have a conversation with her and talk about what you can do with the budget. And, you know, once again, the flexibility of the Pew for letting us allocate a little bit of our funding towards supporting that commissioned piece of artwork, which is now going to be part of our collection. The library company's collection now has a contemporary wampum belt, which is kind of an amazing thing.
Cool. And just for those viewers that are watching right now, I just want to throw in just real quick, because I've done a whole research project on this as well. Making wampum is absolutely time and so skill intensive. So it's not like, you know, I mean, like you see a lot of native beading, which is incredibly, you know, incredible beading, but actually making the beads themselves, and those are traditionally styled beads, like that is, it is so phenomenal. So yeah, I totally lost it when we came in and saw the belt when you had it there, because I know the kind of time that goes into making that. And the care, the craft, the love, the dedication, the spirit, you know, from creation to put that together was astounding. So I just wanted to throw that out for folks that don't know what it takes to craft those beads, not just the making of the belt, the beads themselves is phenomenal. So.
Yeah, it's a whole process, and it looks like they linked her website, so I
Curtis
recommend people to check it out. But that was another sort of reaction I had to, because my tribe does a lot of work with shell bead. So in a small way, I mean, I'm way on the West Coast, and, you know, like Lee's reiterated, we aren't from this tribe that's described in the book. And so there's, you hope that through all of the information that you have and the way that you're presenting it, you're doing those people a service. But to also sort of have this connection, even though it's East Coast, West Coast, like through shell beads and shell craft, seeing that wampum just kind of brought it back home. Like me thinking, if I were to see, traditional Tongva, all of the shell beadwork in a museum exhibition, like how incredible would that be? And it must be so neat for, people on the East Coast to go in and see themselves represented through this. But it also allows other tribal peoples to kind of connect to it, because we're so similar in so many ways. So yeah, that commission was really, really top. Like
Excellent. And as Weshoyot mentioned, there's links in the chat. You can do some research about the artist and look at her work and learn more about her. All right, so this has been a love fest so far. I'm about to ask you about your first fight, and see if you guys disagree at some point. Anyway, first I want to just to trace things back a little bit. In terms, I'm sort of obsessed with this, like this trajectory of your creative process right now. Started as a twinkle in Will's eye, and based on his knowledge and his passion in this content, and then it sounds like in many ways a kind of fortuitous meeting with Lee and Weshoyot at Comic-Con, which became, like I said, this kind of crucible for this kind of chemistry building, and then a lot of trust building on the part of the library company and openness on the part of the artists to see where this could lead. Some really great first meetings, shared values, shared interests, a lot of showing of respect among the four of you and between the organization and the artists, and obviously an interest in this content, right? And the power of the content. But this is an art project, right? At least in many ways, it's a public history project that's primarily the primary vehicle is art. So where do the aesthetic decisions come in at this point? So how did you, Weshoyot, and Lee work together as artists? How did you make aesthetic decisions? What was the role of Will and the library company in those decisions? Will, did you have an aesthetic or aesthetics in mind at all as you were thinking about audiences or who the receivers of this artwork was going to be? So if you guys could talk about those, maybe this is where we get into the fight part, but could you talk about how the aesthetic decisions came to fruition, please?
I'll talk about the artwork. I after our initial trip and seeing the original historical documents and prints, a lot of that artwork is pen and ink, 18th century, 17th century. They did have etchings back then, but a lot of it was actually hand drawn. And I secretly have this little side part of me that collects old illustration books with really old 18th century illustration. And I've dabbled a lot in calligraphy and, working with old antique pens. I'm very kind of anti-digital work. So any project that allows me to embrace, using old methods and techniques, I always kind of like take advantage of it if the person in charge will let me. So I kind of proposed, hey, Will, can I do this in pen and ink? Can I go a little bit outside my regular art style? Because when you compare this to a lot of the work that I've done, Six Killer is a little close to it because I'm kind of mimicking an Alice in Wonderland sort of ink style purposely. This, I think, takes it further, allows that art style to sort of carry the entire book. And And I thought by making that choice, it would also be a good connection between the way art is seen in sort of an academic way. I mean, throughout history, from about 1500s up until the modern advancements of like printing presses and large scale print, those illustrations were always done by hand. And so, you know, with Will's blessing, he kind of let me go off on my own little tangent with the pen and ink and take it as far as I could. So
I'll jump in. Sorry, it's, you know, we're all trying to figure this out. I think from the writing perspective, I mean, I have a few, I don't know if they're necessarily, I guess it's an aesthetic. It's a mission in some ways. Is portraying Native folks, as a writer, portraying Native folks in a very positive way. So my writing is gonna always revolve around that Native folks, and especially in the story, were not victims, but had a particular agency over even the last days of their lives. And Weshoyot and I talked a lot about that. So, and I think I was very much moved, even in some of like the shots that I was framing, because I know Weshoyot's work, the work that she did on, there's a short she did called Red, that deals with violence against Native women. And that has stuck. I mean, the way that she constructed the page is, I literally just I use that in so many spaces, because I'm like, you know, it's this front facing, you know, there's like no filter looking at the audience. And so, you know, I tend to very much write like that, where I'm just like, I want people to see Native faces. I want people to, you know, when I'm writing a scene or when writing a panel, I want people to see Native faces. I want them to recognize those and reconcile with those. So that's a lot of where my writing sort of moves into this space. You know, having to make a lot of historical decisions was really interesting as well, because how do you craft a narrative when the narrative is a bit scattered on this, right? It wasn't, you had the Conestoga, you know, you had the massacre of the Susquehanna Conestoga folks that took place over a 2-week period in December, but then you had the pamphlet war that happened after that. You had the Lenape being moved into Philadelphia city limits for their protection, and the arming of the Quakers happening after that, after this first part of this, as well as having to provide historical context. So that was really what got me thinking aesthetically, and just in terms of writing way of how do you tell a narrative that's scattered across multiple spaces, and then also adhere to, in, you know, particular indigenous frameworks. So, you know, one of the main things that I wanted to put in and didn't get, you know, I mean, this was not a fight part, but one is the creation story. And that beautiful, you know, the one that's my favorite picture illustration of Turtle Island, and talking with Curtis about that, is that when we tell our stories, when this is in many ways for me a traditional story, because we're telling the story now as Native people, and we want people to know that this is the traditional story of the East Coast people, of how Turtle Island came to be, how, you know, how the roots were set, how first man, first woman came out, you know, and populated that, you know, the space in the society. So setting the context in a way that's much deeper than you would normally see necessarily through an academic text or from an anthropological point of view, right? Like, we can point to the fact that they had stone tools over here, or this is, you know, archaeological evidence that this is, our stories are deeper than that. We know we came from time immemorial. And so we wanted to set that framework for people because it sets an indigenous philosophical construct right out the gate, which then led to the other decisions, right? So we made sure, like, the narrative not only goes, you know, sort of bends space and time a little, well, it does. It's not, it bends space and time. It takes place in a meta sense. I included all three of us, me, Will, and Weshoyot are all characters in the comic book itself. We gave Curtis an alter ego in the comic book because I wanted to make sure he was included, so influential. So I wrote a scene for him, and in my notes I was like, the museum keeper, you know, at one scene he's explaining, you know, this old portrait, you know, of the William Penn and the first folks, the Lenape folks, and I was like, yeah, the museum director's Curtis. I think that was my notes. I think literally it was just like, draw Curtis. You know, I was like, because I think there's, you know, one, it's always fun to put your friends in stuff. I love doing that. But I think there's, you know, a particular obligation, because for me, he's a teacher, he's an instructor in that. And so that was my, you know, offering and blessing to him for what he gave to us. So, so there's all sorts of little nuances, but so I'll give you, so where was our first fight? I want to answer that question because Will and I know very well. It's literally the first line of the book. That is the first fight, because so we're sitting on the bus, we're out there, and I'm trying to figure out like how this thing, and I come up with this line, and I write it down in my notebook because I'm taking notes about just structure and trying to figure out how to put all this information together. And it's really funny because I love to talk, but when I start to get like really creative and I start to write, I just shut up. And I'm like, and people are like, "Are you okay?" Because like people have to figure like you're not talking anymore, and I'm just like, yeah, now I'm trying to think, like I got to put all these pieces together. So I write this line down, violence is simple, history is complicated, right? As the first line of the book. And I write that down and I kind of pitch the idea as I'm like, this is the first line. I think this is where it needs to come from. So I write that in the part, and I still remember Will's notes was like, I don't know about that. I don't like that much. This is not my favorite line. And I was like, oh, that's cool. I was like, I'm holding to this line. I really like it. I passed it off to my wife. She's like, nah, I kind of agree with Will. She's all like, violence is not simple. We had a whole, and I was like, yes, but you'll get it in context because there's a whole story that comes. And so, so we come back and the notes back from everybody was just like, love that first line. That was amazing. And so Will was just like, all right, fine, whatever. So that was our first, fight, if you will. But I think it also spoke very well to, kind of what we were all looking at to accomplish. And I was like, listen, I can change it, but I really like that first line because I think it's very dramatic. And I think it also very much sets, again, sort of the philosophical framework of this is that there's moments of violence in American history, and that the participants don't often think about the history leading to that moment is incredibly complicated, and complicated not to justify the act of violence, just to point out how you got from one point to the other. So I think that was, for me, this aesthetic of how we continue to tie back to that of like, history is complicated because also we're not telling the story of the other folks that are part of that history. And that adds another complexity and another level and a depth of the Native folks who never got to tell their story. So those were my guiding stars, but I always like to, as we're closing this out, I tell everybody the secrets behind the scenes. Yeah. I can say that Will,
were you,
I was a fan of that.
Were you involved in that first fight at all, Weshoyot?
A little bit, yeah. I heard through the grapevine that it wasn't necessarily the most liked quote, and I was like, oh, no. Like, if that, like, I mean, just with him talking about it right now, like, it can open up such a potential for a dialogue back and forth, and that's how I saw it. I mean, it's such a simple thing, and yeah, it could be argued whether or not, it's true or false, but the fact that it was like these small little words that would open up this huge discussion. So I heard like it may be removed from the book, and I think I sent Will like an email. I was like, look, Will, like we kind of need that in the book, okay? So like I'm gonna adamantly fight to keep it in the book in case there's any sort of potential for it to be taken out. He had backup. We had backup in case it got to that point.
So, Will, can you talk about that? So, I mean, it sounds like you guys resolved the issue, but Will, can you talk about how you resolved this issue? How did you end up, I don't know whether, maybe you're still bitter about it.
No,
how did you end up resolving the conflict, I guess I'm asking.
So I think one of the things that I had to learn in going through this was how to read a comic script, because I was used to reading a different form. So even like the sort of shorthand that Weshoyot and Lee were communicating to each other through, I had to learn that was sort of like outside of the framework of a graphic novel, because I'm new to this. And so I didn't really feel like it was suitably nuanced enough as a line, like just on its own. But then once it was set in the context of the overall narrative, it works, and Lee was right. I just had to get there, I had to come on the journey with him.
Thank you.
And that's why you open yourself up to something like this. You have to be open to learning from people that have different types of expertise. So ultimately, I let it go at the time. I was a little sour, and then I saw how it worked, and then I was ready to eat crow, but of course I never did.
Worked out great, man.
And I think it was actually on the window display, right, at the gallery.
It is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you got your way.
That is me deferring to Lee, saying, you know what, it's good, it's simple, it's catchy, it's suitably ambiguous to sort of pull people into.
But I think it is important also to discuss and give Will credit, because he was coming at this project from a very academic standpoint, and the world of comics is this whole other thing.
Very much.
You know, me and Lee working together on projects prior to this, but also just working on comics in general. The script writing is a lot different than, you know, film or regular books. And there, I think, is a more artistic underlying current that you can get away with comics that you can't necessarily get away with just academic writing or just writing or just art. It's that combination of words and art together that allow you to sort of create this extra dialogue. And luckily Will was trusting with us, and you know, I'm glad he was open to learning a little bit about it too, because it is a kind of a weird visualization, I think, of the combination of art and writing. But unless you've done it for a while, it sometimes and oftentimes doesn't make sense until you kind of like get the final product out there. But so thank you for bearing with us.
And there's
definitely.
I'm sorry, go ahead. Well,
No,
there's
That's a segue. Go ahead, Lee. Go ahead, Lee.
Oh, I was just going to add, I think it is. I mean, it's one of those things that I've noticed is if you're not part of the comic book industry, it's one of the things of having to kind of tell of like, and especially because Weshoyot and I had worked together before, so my notes are already referencing how I know she is going to craft something in the space itself. And it's such a really wonderfully unique position when you can work in a tandem and you can work with an illustrator, potentially an illustrator you've known before, because there's other ways you got to write. If you've never worked with an illustrator before, then you got to write a little bit different. So then, Will kind of jumping in really to the deep end, because it's already a dialogue that she and I have had, because it's just coming off of the work we've done from a previous comic. And Will's like, what's going on? I don't understand. And so anybody that looks at, and even the folks like the amazing staff at the library company that's going through and trying to edit this, you know, I mean, it's literally, it's a working document. So people are trying to go in and they're trying to figure out, they're like, should we copy edit this part? And so I was having to tell Will, I was like, don't copy edit the descriptions, because you don't need to do that. Like, when we get a little bit later, look for toes, because we did put it at the back of the book, but I'm like, otherwise don't worry about it right now, because we can formalize that later on. But you want it, this is a document that's going to go to the illustrator is going to need to put this together. All you need to do is look for typos in the text, like whatever's going to be on the page, that's what we need to focus. So like explaining that kind of stuff. And I will say to your infinite credit, you're real quick, like you jumped on board that fast. Like you were like, at the end of this, you're like, I know how to read comics now, kids, we're good. You know, it was great. It was great.
Excellent. So in terms of my segue, one of my favorite quotes that I've heard in the last few years is by one of my favorite museum professionals. His name is Dan Spock. He ran the Minnesota History Center for a long time. Incredibly thoughtful man. And he once said to me that within the context of museum work, that the opposite of playful, is not serious. The opposite of playful is drudgery. And he strongly believes, and I have come to believe, that playfulness and seriousness can live alongside each other quite well in terms of museum interpretation and experience building. At any point in this project, did any of you have questions about this seemingly playful platform being used to illuminate such a serious subject? I'm not just serious, but it's human atrocity. So it's about as serious as you can get.
Do you mean using comic book format and illustration art and tackling the subject matter? Is that kind of where you're leading?
Mm-hmm.
I mean the comic book format, and I realize that it's a reductive definition or understanding of the comic book as playful, and I know it's much more complicated. You know, obviously, comic books have always been much more complicated than that. But for some, it's perceived as a playful format. I'm sure you're all aware when Mouse came out, when Art Spiegelman's Mouse came out, there were some questions about utilizing that format to deal with the Holocaust. And so I guess I'm heading off maybe any questions that either were there or might be there about using this format to illuminate and document an atrocity.
I would say that over the last 10 years, I've been in comics for over 15 years. When I first started in the industry, it was a lot of superhero comics. There were historical comics, but they weren't, seen often. It was more on the independent format. Most of the historically based comic books that I were familiar with were either independently written, which meant they weren't backed by any academic writers, historians, anything like that. It was just sort of self-research. So it was generally stuck into the realm of this is, very fiction. There's a lot of artistic license that they could put into it. A lot of the Western comics are like that, and in the sheer numbers that they have and the fact that so many of them are not done by Native people, it kind of skews the Western historical format of comics. So you've got sort of Westerns, you have superhero comics, you have a small section of independent comics, and within those independent comics is usually where the historical based ones are, as far as, I'm familiar with. I think in Europe, the comic book format is very much more respected than it is here in the States. And growing up, the artists that I really were inspired by and books that I read were oftentimes either from Japan or they were French and European. There are some Spanish ones too. So a lot of heavy metal stuff, a lot of early sort of experimental 70s, 1980s era comics where they're tackling very adult subject matter. I was actually just talking about this yesterday on a phone interview, and I brought up Masumi Shiro's Ghost in the Shell. So many people are familiar with the Scarlett Johansson. I think she, was cast in the American Thing, which is based on an anime, which is an animated movie from the 80s that a lot of people are familiar with. But that's actually based on a manga, and it's this huge, thick comic book. And if anybody's ever read it, it deals with the state of politics within AI. And this was written back in the 80s. And so it deals with how human rights are violated, how sex workers are used and violated, where the line is between human rights and robotic rights. So it tackles a huge amount of political topics. And it was written for adults. It's an adult graphic novel comic book. So I think in that, there is this huge vein of comic books that handle adult subject matter and historical subject matter, and they're well respected. But yeah, you do run the risk of mentioning comic books as having sort of a juvenile or a more lighthearted feel to them. In the recent years, you have a lot of major publishers that are realizing how powerful comic and graphic novels are in tackling historical subject matter. And so they're choosing to, hire more artists and writers to tackle historical subjects because they're seeing that these can be used in schools and they can reach people from a huge variety of ages, from younger kids to teenagers to adults. And oftentimes it helps to engage the attention spans as well, having the visual and the writing combined. So I think graphic novels which is sort of like the more academic term than comic books, but even comic books, I think that they can respectfully and responsibly handle adult subject matter without it being downplayed.
I'll echo that very briefly. I think that comic books and the what do we say, the sequential art format, as the art term is really called, right? Is very long and deep, and I think that utilizing that, because I mean, if we think about the ways in which we can communicate something like this, right? So you would have you could do it in a novel format. You're telling a story as, you know, some sort of maybe historical fiction. You can do a straight history, which we have some incredible examples that we drew from, you know, Jack Brubaker's work, obviously it's something from that. You could do it in a film type of production. And you could do it as a theatrical production or performance. I think there's lots of ways in which to be able to communicate this that we share as humans, communicating. You could do it in a monologue. But I think there's something so unique around the comic book format, because you're wedding, you're combining, you're stitching together, you're weaving together the words, the historical you know, foundations with images, and with those images you're providing something that is even more dynamic. In my mind, I think it's also much more, it engages the brain more. If I was to choose between making this out of a comic book or a movie, I would pick a comic book first, because the format allows for your brain to do the heavy lifting. It allows for more metaphorical work, as you can see later in the book when we showcase, you know, the final death of the Susquehannock. We do that, and that tied metaphor with the wampum, which Weshoyot came up with. That was something we had to kind of reorient, right? You can't really do that as easily in any other medium except for comics, and except for this graphic representation. You can't do that. Like, you could kind of do it in a movie, but you're still operating at 60 frames a second. So there's a whole different way that you would have to space that out. But by that image work, I think that it's not, you know, for me, it's not necessarily like, it is a brilliant, you know, artistic way to reimagine something that happened that is tragic, but in a way that gives light and hope. If it's done skillfully, and I hope he did that, but, you know, if it's done skillfully, it can bring light and hope in a way that you can't see anywhere else in any other medium.
Yeah, you certainly did. So not only is it appropriate format, it's an ideal format. Will, did you want to add to that?
Well, yeah, the one thing that I would add as the resident nerd here is that, you know, you've seen a lot of universities thinking about the form of graphic histories and really pairing graphic art with a lot of context. And what I wanted to do was really take what like Oxford University Press has done with their graphic history series, and to imagine what it would look like for public school, high school, middle school. And so I really do think that, and this is a credit to Lee's ingenuity in terms of being able to fit just so much stuff into 120 pages. But I mean, we have 60 pages that are Weshoyot's beautiful art and Lee's beautiful story. And then the other 60 are everything you need to understand it, to situate it, to complicate it. And those include artist statements, those include primary source records, that includes the annotated script, which I think is honestly something that's really neat that I didn't know was a common thing in comic books. But now I think all scholars ought to think about doing, because it sort of opens up the editorial process. You know, it's a sort of brilliant, sort of showing your work and the conversations you had around it. So, you know, the fact that that is part of the book, I think really speaks to the fact that it takes the play that's happening throughout the book. And I think there is a lot of play in this book, but it also brings a sort of sense of seriousness and care. You know, like for me, seriousness is subordinated to care. And I feel like one of the great things about having so much back matter, so much context, is that we can really be clear about who we're obligated to. Oh.
I will say that the way this book was put together with the back matter, is something that I love to see. And I always buy sort of the director's cut in film so I can watch the behind the scenes stuff. And I also, if I can get like a hardbound, you know, the higher up book that has all the making of and stuff, that's oftentimes what I will purchase. But the fact that, you know, Will and Lee decided to do this with the paperback version and not only have all the background material in it, so somebody going into a bookstore isn't kind of taken aback, like, what is this about, you know? They're allowed to have that in, you know, combination with the actual artwork for the book. But the fact that if people do go to the website, it's like a mirrored support system. You have the graphic novel available on the website. You also have lesson plans on the website. You have all this amazing work and research and things that go, you know, as a support for the project, just constantly going back and forth between something you can physically hold in your hands and something that's totally digital that you could use in a classroom or share with people who maybe can't purchase the book, or they don't know where to buy the book, or they're new to it, or in this case, if they're sold out because of all the pre-orders and stuff. But yeah, it's like most times there's sort of a lack between that connection if you have digital support and, you know, behind the scenes or annotations for whatever the project is. And that's another thing that I thought was incredible, is the way that you guys tie that together and how the website really, really supports this book and vice versa.
It does. So Will, I did a really bad job of leaving room for Q&A. What would you like to do about that?
Well, we can adjourn, but we can always allow folks to submit questions, and I can respond to them as best I can, and where I can't answer them, I will bring in Lee and Weshoyot, who are used to being bothered by me.
No problem.
Excellent. Well, thank you all very much for a terrific conversation of your process, walking us through what it took to make something so special like this happen. I really, really hope that other organizations similar to the Library Company will think about this format and will think about working with artists. And as you can see, there was some risk taking you know, in every way here, from the artist's point of view, from the organization's point of view, but it was worth it. These kinds of projects are often the result of some really calculated and thoughtful risk taking. So I think it's a fabulous model project, and I hope others will continue to learn from it. So thanks, guys. You did a really bang up job. Congratulations.
Thank you,
Thank
Bill.
you, thank you. Before we go, Bill, I also just want to add one last thing to everybody out there. Please, right now, it is so important to support Native creatives. People like Weshoyot, people like the folks that we work with as illustrators and as writers. This is the time to really, like, you know, get a Ghost River, get something, like, you know, support their work, because, you know, we're not getting an Indigenous Comic-Con this year right now. So that's a lot of the times that they're going out and doing this stuff. So find Native creatives online, show them some beautiful love, make sure that, you know, we just continue to spread this word, because it's super important that we wouldn't be able to continue to do this work like a Ghost River if we're not able to support and feed our families. And that's just the kind of the bottom line. So I know I'm eternally grateful for Pew and the Library Company and all y'all for being able to do this, but it can't stop here. So please, 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 this is the things, retweet, support. Anytime you find a Native creative that you like, show them some love. Show them some love. Thanks.